All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome officially to Tuesday, coming to you live from the surface of the sun, or maybe Vancouver. It's hard to tell. Um, how'd you guys do yesterday? Pretty hot? Pretty hot. Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Okay, so let's see. Miles is here. Good morning, Miles. Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. Unadi is here. Good morning. Um, let's dive in. So, yesterday we said that Lenin had died, right? Not of heat. He had died of a stroke, and there were basically a few different camps. There was Trotsky out on the left, there was Bukharin in the right, and then there was Stalin in the center, right? And we know that Joseph Stalin is going to be the winner of this leadership contest, right? He's the one who's going to shape the Soviet Union, and again, it's worth paying attention to who he is because he's an important guy, right? So, and he's got great hair. Okay, so I asked you to read this yesterday in order to answer some questions. Are we ready to talk about that, or do we need a few minutes to review? Few minutes? Okay, I am going to put 5 minutes on the clock. Then we're going to talk about this short section, okay? Oh, and I'll put the questions up on the screen too, because you'll need those. What kind of a person is he? Why do you think people don't compare, don't compare people to Stalin as much as they compare people to Hitler? And what do you think are some of the things that motivated Stalin to do the things he did? Okay, so 5 minutes, you can read that section of the textbook, and then we will talk, okay? Okay, so time's up. Tell me, Jim, tell me one thing about Stalin. How can we describe him? What's he like?
He's a dictator.
Okay, so he's a dictator, right? He kind of positions himself as the sole leader of the Soviet Union, right? Although there's lots of other people in the Communist Party, he's gonna dominate them, right? And if you get in his way, might be a problem for you, right? Daniel, tell me one thing about Joseph Stalin. Okay, Mark, tell me one thing about Joseph Stalin.
He's ruthless and very ambitious
Okay, so he's got a lot of ambition. He's ruthless.
because he killed a lot of his political opponents, and then he also murdered around tons of people. I forgot the reason that why he murdered the people, and also set up some camps to let the people get it. And
Yeah, he's definitely ruthless, right? So we know, and we'll read a little bit more. He, gets rid of his political enemies. We already know that he had Leon Trotsky assassinated, right? Later on in the late 30s, during his Great Purge, he's going to go ahead and kill anyone who he thinks could oppose him, right? So lots of people are going to die just because they might disagree with what he says, right? There's huge numbers of Soviet citizens that are going to die through his collectivization attempts and his industrialization attempts. So uh, he's a murderer, right? And he's easily responsible for as many deaths as Hitler is, if not more, right? So this guy is pretty brutal, right? And he doesn't really have a lot of respect for human life, right? What else do we know about him? Yoya, give me one thing.
his paintings and classical education is very taken into develop extreme limits.
Sorry, say the last part one more time.
To develop extreme limits.
To prepare.
To develop extreme limits.
Oh, he has an excellent memory. Yeah, he does, right? They call him, what do they call him? Comrade Card Index. Do you have any idea what a card index is? Probably not. You're way too young. Even I'm almost way too young. When you used to have to go to the library to look something up, before the internet, before computers, you would have to look in these really long drawers, okay? So the drawer would be like this long, and they'd have all these little cards in it, and all the cards would have entries. And so if you were looking for, a book on birds, you'd go to the big subject card index and you'd pull out the drawer that was B, and you'd start flipping through it until you found the heading birds, and then it would give you all the books that had birds that were about birds. So that's a card index, obviously a nightmare if you wanted to go to the library, 40 years ago or whatever. But yeah, he's like a card index. So he's got all these things filed away in his head, right? All of this information, and he can just pull it out, right? Whatever you need, he can remember it, right? So yeah, good memory, right? Smart guy, pretty sharp up there, right? Which actually is not a great mix, right? He's super smart, but he's also ruthless and willing to, let as many people die as necessary. It's not a good combination. What else do we kind of know about him? Mark, you were going to say something before? Did you lose it? What's his whole thing with Koba? Who's Koba? Because he wants to be called that, right? He wants to be called Koba, but who is Koba?
I searched Kobe and Google, so like the movie about like Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, no, don't Google it because it was in the thing you just read, or you should have just read.
It's like Kobe is like the hero of the story, like one of the character.
Yeah, it's like an old Russian story, right? Except it's an old Russian story. Kind of got a Robin Hood like character, a character who steals from rich people to give to poor people, right? And so, yeah, so Stalin wants to be called when he's younger. He wants to be called Koba, right? Which is kind of interesting. Do you like walk around and ask your friends to call you Spider-Man or Thor? Probably not, right? So it's kind of interesting that he imagines himself as a hero, right? As a kid, he imagines himself as this character who helps the people and takes from the rich and gives to the poor, right? Um, and then he kind of, as he grows up, he finds another hero, right? He finds a hero in Lenin, right? He thinks that Lenin is this, I think he describes him as a mountain eagle, right? Some sort of like great leader of some kind. What do we know about his home life, like his parents and his childhood? What do they say?
Like his father,
Did his father's what?
his father was always John,
Yeah.
maybe that's the voice of his wife and his son.
Yeah. So his dad he was a cobbler. He was somebody who made shoes, I guess. But yeah, he was an alcoholic, right? He was drunk all the time, and he beat or physically abused both Stalin and his mother, right? So it's pretty brutal, right? That's a tough way to grow up. Um, and so I think that's kind of enough about Stalin. But why do you think this is a tough question actually? But why do you think people talk so much about Hitler, right? Well, when we want to say that someone is bad, we compare them to Hitler, right? Whether it's a good comparison or not, we often do it. But why do we not compare people to Stalin very often? Because
Because Hitler is more famous. And it's not more famous, it's like more famous of doing like all that kind of bad things.
he,
Like the concentration camp, like about the Jews and about like all the
he,
like World War II stuff.
he's undoubtedly more famous, right? Hitler is undoubtedly more famous. But as we'll read very shortly, or as you might already know, Stalin is responsible for the death of millions of people in the Soviet Union. And not that you want to get into sort of comparing atrocities here, but they're Stalin's own people, right? Like, again, I'm not trying to explain away anything here, but, you know, Hitler did a lot of horrible things, but he did take care of the Germans, right? He did take care of his people. Here, Stalin is actually murdering his people, right? He's murdering Russian citizens. So, again, you don't want to get into a comparison of who's worst, but yeah, like, why is Hitler so much more famous than Stalin?
Hitler, as we can say that he get all of the New York, and like he killed a lot of people from other countries. So like, for example, my grandpa was died because of Hitler, and like elderly people.
Yeah.
But like I am Chinese, so so Stalin won't kill like he don't kill like Chinese. So like my grandpa was impossible to kill by Stalin. So like because of like the Hitler did a lot of the brutal things to a lot of countries, and like Stalin just do the brutal things in like in his own country. So for the people who is in the other countries, they don't like remember those Stalin.
That's a good point, right? So if you look at kind of Western history, which is kind of what we're dealing with here, yeah, Hitler has a lot to do, right? Because he starts a war with Western countries, right? Canada fought a war against Nazi Germany, right? And at the end of World War II, when finally Germany was beaten, everybody saw what Hitler had been up to, right? We found the camps, right? The death camps like Auschwitz and Dachau and all these. It was on the front page of newspapers. Everyone was like, oh, right? Everyone was shocked about what had happened. We all kind of, it was very much kind of in the spotlight. But I think what you mentioned is correct, right? So this was happening in the context of a war and two, people that were kind of connected to the West. But with Stalin, it's all happening within the Soviet Union, right? And so if you're not in the Soviet Union, you're probably not really being affected by what he's doing, right, in the 1930s and 40s and early 50s. The other thing is that, when the West found out what Hitler had been doing, it was all across the newspapers, right? Like, people reported on it, everybody knew. But do you think that was the same thing inside the Soviet Union at the time? No, right?
After Stalin, like 3 years, follow the next leader criticized Stalin.
He did. He absolutely did. But before, he criticized Stalin, but actually it'll be until the 1980s until like Russians can finally talk about what really happened with Stalin, right? Because a lot of the things that Stalin did were not publicized, right? They didn't show up in the newspaper, right? The newspapers were controlled by the Communist Party. So people never read about them. People didn't know what was happening, or they kind of knew just through word of mouth, right? People would talk, but nobody really knew the numbers. Nobody knew what was happening. It wasn't publicized, right? People went to the Soviet Union and, they were shown, like Western journalists went to the Soviet Union and they were shown what the Soviet Union wanted them to see, right? A peaceful, prosperous communist country. But that's not really what was going on, right? There was a lot of brutality, there was a lot of sickness, there was a lot of starvation, but none of that got reported outside the Soviet Union. And so, yeah, I would say that, a lot of people know who Hitler is and they know what Hitler did, but a lot of people don't know who Stalin was or what Stalin did, right? And again, part of that is because, I think you're right to point out, Jim, is that it only happened within the country. It didn't happen to other countries. But also because there was no reporting, right? Nobody was reporting on what Stalin was doing in his country. Certainly not the Soviets. And so nobody knew for a really long time. And so in the West, we've been able to, vilify and compare people to Hitler for decades now, right? But we really couldn't pay attention to Stalin at the time, and then by the time that, you were able to talk about him, nobody was interested in talking about him anymore because he'd been dead for 40 years or 50 years. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? That we very quickly compare bad people to Hitler, and yet, I would argue that Stalin is equally as awful, right? It's just, yeah, it's different, right? Why do you think Stalin might have done the things that he did? Why do you think he was so brutal? Why do you think he had this kind of drive for power and control?
He's motivated by like Lenin. Like he treat Lenin as an idol, as like how to rule the country.
He did idolize Lenin, right? He did see him as this kind of great leader, but also wanted to be like him, right? He wanted to replace Lenin when Lenin was gone, right? Definitely inspired by Lenin, for sure. Why else do you think he did the things that he did?
I think that the childhood experience shape you a lot.
Yeah?
Because his childhood was not that good. Like when he was young, his life is not that good at all.
Yeah.
That's why I think that maybe part of the reason why he kill others or always like life in his future.
Yeah,
Maybe a part of the reasons.
that may be, right? He had a pretty brutal upbringing, right? Lots of violence directed at him and his mother, and yeah, maybe he maybe he directed that violence outward later on, right? Or it sort of changed him in some way, maybe, right? Although lots of people have abusive childhoods and don't go on to murder millions of people, but still, it might have played a role, right?
And I think it's also because of when he was the leader of Soviet Union until World War II was beginning. He is the leader who leads the Soviet Union to against Germany. Like there are a lot of wars and there are a lot of people dies every day.
Yeah.
And so like the life is what can I say? At that time, like you can say a lot of people die every day. So like they don't think kill someone is big thing. But there already have a lot of people die. But like in the day of now, like when we are in the peace, like who is dying is a big thing. But like in the world, yeah. So I think it's also part of the reason why he's so.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Yeah, if you look at sort of World War One or World War Two, the numbers of people who were dying in those wars, it probably normalized death, right? And so, when tens of thousands of people are dying in a war every day, maybe it's not such a big deal if 60,000 people die in your country, right? Maybe that's just not as shocking then as it would be right now, right? Yeah, I think that's a good observation too, right? People were more used to having large numbers of people dying, right? Maybe. Anything else we should highlight about Stalin before we move on? Who he was, why he did what he did, how we think about him. I found it interesting what they said. I don't remember exactly, but it was the author said, like, to be in the same room with him, you could almost like feel the force of his personality, right? Like he's such a strong person. You can actually like being in the room with him is like, ugh, like you can feel that. That's an interesting sort of observation, and I wonder what he was like. I wonder what it would have been like to be around someone like that, Right? That would have been strange. Okie dokie, people. So now that that's done, I have just a couple pages for you to read and a couple of questions to answer, and this is just going to take us through some of the Stalin years, okay? So some of the important events in Stalin's reign. It's a long one, right? He's going to succeed Lenin in about 1924 or 25 maybe, and then he's going to die in 1953. So we have basically a 30-year period in which Stalin is going to be in charge of the Soviet Union. So we're going to compress that 30 years into 3 pages, okay? But let's have a read, and then I'll ask you these questions that'll just highlight a few of the important things that happened in the Soviet Union under Stalin, and that'll kind of bring us back up to the end of World War II, which is where we were a week or so ago, okay? So I'll give you some time to read, and then we'll discuss, all right? I think. Do you see those pages in Microsoft Teams? Are they there? No? Let me look here. 83 to 86. Okay, hang on. Maybe I just didn't put them in. 83. Okay. Okay, they should be there now. Okay, ready, good people? All right, so the first question there, question number 15, is a little bit tricky because I think that's defined just in the section immediately before. But do you want to take a swing at it? What's a collective farm?
It's a farm or a number of farms owned as a region.
Yeah, it's a place where a number of farmers work, right? So in sort of a more capitalist system or under the czars, you had individual farmers working their farm, right? But now we're going to collectivize them. So we're going to take, all of your farms, we're going to put them together into one big farm, and you're all going to work on it in a cooperative fashion, right? So not every person for themselves, farming for themselves and their family, but everybody's working together, and the farm is owned by the state, right? Now, more tricky question. What is a kulak? What is a kulak? And again, that might not have been defined in this section, so if you want some help, I can help you with that, but some type of what? Yeah, the kulaks are wealthy farmers, right? So remember with Lenin, he had his new economic policy and he allowed people to kind of run small businesses and keep the profit, right? So some people had small farms, but they were big enough to actually have to hire people to work on it, right? And so there were some people that gained money and power, right? These are kulaks, people who had control of pieces of land, they hired people to work on the land, and they kept the money, they kept the profit, right? In a pure socialist system or communist system, everyone's equal, right? But these kulaks started to rise above everyone else, right? They started to have more money and more power. What's a nepmen? What are nepmen? Yeah. So they're kind of like kulaks, except instead of farming, they own businesses, right? So people who own small businesses, they have people working for them, and they make profits too, right? So again, these people shouldn't really exist in a pure communist system, right? Everyone is supposed to be working for the state. Everyone's supposed to be equal, right? But because of Lenin's new economic policy, some people are able to gain some money and power, right? These are kulaks out in the country and nepmen out in the cities for the most part. So but Stalin is going to collectivize farms, and what's he going to do with kulaks and nepmen? What's going to happen to those people? This might not be clearly spelled out either, but
they don't allow them to they want to control the social media as a big company. Everyone wants to
yeah. So remember, Stalin was not interested in the new economic policy, right? He wanted pure socialism. And so, under Lenin, these kulaks and nepmen start to gain a little bit of money and a little bit of power. And ooh, you okay? Stalin is going to say no, right? Stalin is going to kick these guys out. He's going to strip them of their land, and he's going to either exile or murder them, right? Sometimes in textbooks they call this the liquidation of the kulaks, right? Liquidation. But really what he means is he's going to take their land, he's going to take their money, and he's going to kick them out, right? And a lot of these kulaks are going to die, right? Or they're going to be sent to a labor camp. Because again, they're not only should they not exist in a communist system, but now they have kind of a capitalist mindset, right? And Stalin doesn't want that either. And so these people are going to be made to disappear, right? And so Stalin's going to take care of the kulaks, he's going to take care of the Nep men, and he's going to collectivize agriculture, right? Why is that so important, collectivizing agriculture? Why is that so important?
Because like you need to like central the power to one political party, like the economy,
He needs to do what?
like central power of the entire country.
Yeah, he needs to centralize power for the country, right? He needs to take control of agriculture so that he can hopefully make it efficient, right? And hopefully be able to feed the people. Does that work? He collectivizes agriculture. Does it result in sort of does it result in kind of an agricultural boom?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. Because like in the tax policy, like the productivity will increase a lot. The farming.
Well, you would think so. You would think so, but the problem is that they still struggle to produce enough food for their country, right? So, yes, Stalin succeeds in collectivizing it. He sets up all of these collective or state farms. He minimizes the workforce so that a bunch of these people can be sent to the cities to work in industry, right? He does that. So that works. But still, the agricultural sector is not really working very well. And I think it says that the Soviet Union is still not able to feed its people, right? And again, spoiler alert, but it's never going to be able to feed its people until the Soviet Union collapses. So it's the same problem that the czars were facing, that Lenin was facing, that Stalin was facing. How can we produce enough food to feed ourselves? And yet they can't seem to figure it out, right? They can't seem to produce enough to feed themselves. So I would say that the collectivization process itself works, like he does it, but it doesn't really result in the kind of agricultural increase that he's looking for, right? So he does it, but it just doesn't benefit the country in the way he kind of hopes. All right, do you want to take a little break? Okay, let's take a break. All right, take a 10-minute break, come back, and then we'll pick it up at question 18, okay? Okay, and we are back. So we're right in the middle of these questions here. We're at number 18. How is industrialization carried out by Stalin? So what's his industrialization plan here?
He gets the money from farmers and use this money to develop.
Right. So he's got to industrialize, right? He's got to build factories and all kinds of things, but he has no money, right? He can't really borrow from European countries because European countries don't like the Soviet Union, right? They don't like communism. So he can't really go to other people for loans, and so he kind of taxes his own people, right? So everything you kind of buy in the Soviet Union in this period comes with a pretty heavy tax on it, right? And he takes that money and he puts it back into industry. And so that's what they talk about there when they talk about I think it's the GNP, right? Where a lot of it's going to private consumption, 80%, and in the Soviet Union it's going to 52. So he is basically, all the money that people usually get to spend on things that they like clothes and, not that iPhones exist, but iPhones and stuff like that. Stalin's going to tax you instead, and he's going to put that money into industry, right? So the people here, the people in the Soviet Union in this period have enough, they can eat, they can buy simple clothes, they can, have just the very basic essentials, but any money that they would have made on top of that is basically going to tax, and that tax money is basically funding industrialization, right? What are some of his targets? What does he want to see? His industrial targets. There's a bunch of numbers.
If he proposed a power plant, they want to. It is like established from an economic plan for the country and around about like the 5 years plan.
Yeah. So he creates plans every 5 years. These are called GOS plan. GOS is short for the Russian word for state, государственный, if you're interested. So these государственные plans, these state plans, every 5 years a new one. And what does he want to see? What are his targets?
Increase the productivity.
Yeah, but how much? How much does he want to increase production? Yeah, let's see what he says here. Right. Here are the goals. This is the first 5-year plan. So in 5 years, he wants the total output to increase 250%, right? Heavy industrial production by 330%, iron production by 300%, coal by 200%, electricity by 400%. That's crazy. Do you know how much the Canadian economy grows every year? If we're lucky, by like 1% or 2%. And that's kind of what we like. That's what most countries like, is just a nice steady growth, right? A couple percent every year. Nothing exciting. That's what we all like. He's saying, right? He wants things to increase 200 or 300% over 5 years. That's insane, right? Those are huge targets. But does he meet them? More like, is he successful? Yeah, shockingly he is, right? He takes this country that, is kind of backwards and, sort of a bunch of poor, peasant farmers, and he turns it into an industrial superpower in like 12 years. Unbelievable, right? This is, we kind of joked around that, Hitler's plan was to make Germany great again. And he kind of did that, right? And some people have a lot of respect for Hitler because of that. And Stalin, in some ways, does the same thing, except the Soviet Union was never great before. So Germany was powerful at one point, and then it wasn't, and then Hitler made it powerful again. But here, the Soviet Union was never powerful, right? So Stalin takes this country from nothing to an industrial superpower, right? A power that is capable of fighting the Second World War. Right? And again, yeah, their designs are not as good, their technology is not as good, but he does it, right? He achieves these goals. Okay, so I think that's 1819. How should we answer these questions? Because they're kind of, let's answer question 20 first. What's Comintern? What's Comintern?
It's like a lot of countries with communism and like they stay together in like each other. It's like a kind of
Yeah, so Comintern is Communist International, right? So this is the Soviet Union's foreign policy trying to kind of encourage communists in other countries, right? So lots of other countries have communist parties at this time. They're usually pretty small, but the Soviet Union is going to help them along, right? They're going to send them money and give them assistance so that they can spread communism in their home country, right? So we see here that, remember when we said back in Nazi Germany where, remember when Hitler tried to overthrow the government? The Munich Putsch or the Beer Hall Putsch? Remember that? Remember that? Yeah. So he tried to overthrow the government. The Nazis tried to overthrow the government. It didn't work. A bunch of them got shot. Hitler wound up in jail. But communists actually did succeed. They did overthrow the government for a few days before they got kicked back out again. And those kind of parties were being funded by the Soviet Union. Those communist parties were being helped out by the Soviet Union. And so Comintern kind of seeks to support communists in other countries to try to get a communist revolution going in other places. Right? That's kind of what it's for. So I don't think we need to go into much detail for number 19. So we know that the Soviet Communist Party is supporting other groups, right? But it's in other countries. But it's also trying to sort of make connections and make friends with others, right? And so we see that the Soviets kind of start to ally themselves with who? But first of all, yeah, they kind of have a thing once they enter the League of Nations, but they start, who's their first kind of contact? Who do they kind of make an agreement with? Treaty of Rapallo. Yeah. They're going to ally themselves with Germany, right? Because, again, the Soviet Union is going to need some financial support. They're going to need a trading partner. Maybe they can get some technological help as well. And what does Germany need? Well, Germany needs a friend. What's that? Yeah, raw materials, but Germany needs a friend too, right? Because this is after World War I when, remember, nobody wants to buy German products, right? Nobody wants to really play ball with Germany, and Germany's struggling, right? So these two powers kind of unite, right? Because nobody wants to play with either of them at this point. And so they're going to kind of ally themselves. Later, they're going to sign the Nazi Soviet non-aggression pact, right? But for now, they're going to do some trading. There's going to be some financial support. The Germans will be allowed to do military training inside the Soviet Union, which they mention is the Treaty of Versailles says no, the Germans aren't allowed to do that, but they do it anyway inside the Soviet Union. So they're going to try to find some. They're going to try and find some allies, right? And it's going to take them a little while. France is they're going to ally themselves with Czechoslovakia. They're going to join the League of Nations. And so, they're going to slowly kind of branch out and make connections. But there is going to be a lot of mistrust. People will not trust the Soviet Union because they're communists. And during this period, and actually from this period onwards, there's lots of red scares. Do you know what a red scare is? No? So red scare is kind of a fear of communism. So people like Hitler, but also other governments, are kind of using propaganda in order to make their citizens afraid of communists or a communist revolution. Hitler does it for sure. The US will do it a little bit later on during the Cold War. And so because everyone is scared of a communist revolution, it kind of makes the Soviet Union into, I guess kind of a country that people are afraid of, right, or are suspicious of. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. Okay, hang on, let me just see where I am, and that'll help me. Okay. So, quick review here. So, 1927, Stalin is fully in charge, and he starts his revolution from above. Again, keep in mind that according to Karl Marx, a communist revolution is supposed to come from below, right? It's supposed to come from the bottom. But here it's coming from the top, and Stalin is going to impose communism with an iron fist, right, on the Soviet Union. Anyone who gets in his way, it's not going to turn out well, right? People who oppose his regime, who oppose the Communist Party, they're going to be sent to slave labor camps, right, and work camps. People in his inner circle who disagree with him, they're going to be executed, right, or jailed. Kulaks and netmen who have made money in sort of a capitalist way because of the new economic policy, they're going to be pushed aside, right? They're going to be stripped of their money and land and probably sent off to Siberia to a work camp, right? So again, Lenin was trying to sort of get communism going. Stalin is going to establish it with an iron fist, right? And anyone who doesn't cooperate is going to die. So we said his 5-year, the first of his 5-year plans is wildly optimistic, hundreds of percent increases. Again, you don't see this in world economies, right? You see a few percent increase, but he's looking to catch up, right? Because the Soviet Union is well behind, right? If you look where the Soviet Union is in 1928, Britain was probably in that state 60 years earlier, maybe. So the Soviet Union is 60 years behind the other powers, right? And Stalin catches them up in 12 years. Wild, right? But again, he does it with heavy taxation and, again, with brutality, right? Anyone who gets in his way, again, it's not going to turn out very well for you. We said he collectivizes agriculture. And that works, right? He does manage to create these state and collective farms. He does get people working on them. He does kind of manage to free up a bunch of people that he sends to the cities to work in industrial formats. But still, it doesn't work in that the Soviet Union still isn't able to increase the amount of food it produces. So again, it's not producing enough food to feed its people, right? The other thing that'll show up is that Stalin will do this, but all future Soviet leaders will do this as well. They'll actually sell grain on the open market. They'll sell it to the world. So even though they don't have enough grain to feed their people, they'll sell some on the open market because they're trying to convince people that communism works, right? Communism has to be seen as working. So they sell grain on the open market so that it looks like they have so much that they're just selling off their excess grain. But in fact, they don't have enough to feed their people. So they're selling some of their grain over here, but they're buying other people's to feed Soviet citizens, right? So it's kind of stupid and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But again, communism has to be seen as working. So they do this all the way through. Yeah, so this is what they call the liquidation of the kulaks, right? The kulaks are kind of swept aside, their money and their property are confiscated, and they're kind of deported to work camps, right? Because again, they don't fit into the Soviet system, right? They're kind of capitalists, and so they can't really be allowed to continue as they are. Let me see. Let's see. Okay, I think we've talked about all this. I think we've talked about most of that. And that brings us to, yes, that brings us to this. I want to talk about the Ukrainian famine, or the Ukrainian genocide, or Holodomor, if you will. Because again, it's another example of genocide, right? We said that after the Holocaust and the Second World War, the UN got together and passed a convention on genocide, right? Describing what this crime actually was. And we've seen this slide before. It says that genocide has to do with systematically harming or killing members of a group, or doing other things to ensure that that group will not continue, right? So you impose living conditions that make sure that that group won't survive. You keep people from reproducing. You transfer children out of that group and raise them in another group. Anything you do to kind of end a group of people counts, right? It counts as genocide. And so what I would like to do is look at this particular instance of genocide here in the Soviet Union. Again, it is not a commonly known one, right? Like Jim pointed out earlier, it happened within Soviet borders, right? To Soviet people, I guess, although the Ukrainians are often seen as distinct from the Russians, although they're kind of, it's not that much of a difference, but still they're seen as different. And so here we have another example of one group destroying another one, right? So what I would like you to do is just take a few minutes to read this. It's just 2 pages, and oh yeah, and there's questions at the end. There's 3 questions or so. Let me just see. In Microsoft Teams, if you look, it is called, I think it's page 8081 is what it is. Yeah, there it is. So it's just 2 pages, and then, as I mentioned at the end, there's 5 questions, but I think I just want you to answer I think I just want you to answer the first 4, okay? So yeah, so I'll give you a few minutes to read this so we can talk about it. Where's my little counter here? Just gonna put 8 minutes on the clock. It's in Microsoft Teams. It's called page 8081. I'll let you read it very quickly, then we'll talk, okay? Okay, so first question. So before we get into this, for online people, if you're still here, can you just can you put in the live chat a little hi or emoji or whatever you want, just so I know you're still here? People who are in class, I will ask you. So the first question is comparing these two famines, right? These two periods of agricultural failure or food shortage or whatever you want to call it. There's two different famines, one in 1921-22 and one in 1932-33. So what's the important difference between these two famines? What's the important difference between these two famines? Okay. This isn't going to work. What are we going to do? Like, what are we going to do when I give you, 10 minutes to read 2 pages and then ask you a very simple question about it, and I'm not hearing anything, and I'm very skeptical, hey Baha, very skeptical that anyone is actually even reading what we're supposed to be reading. So, yeah, I'm getting frustrated, and this isn't gonna work for me. Okay? Now, if you want to sit here and waste your parents' money, that's fine. That's between you and your parents. It's not my business, right? But you're wasting my time, and that's not fair or acceptable to me. So, what are we going to do? Yeah, that's what I thought.
So there's two family working,
Okay.
and one of them like in 1932 was like also like a million people died or starved,
Yeah.
and also like even mixed famine in
Well, people starve to death in both, right?
it's because like it caused because of the government policy.
Which one? Which one was?
The green
Was it the what?
Industrialization like produced a kind of shift of population,
Right.
and then from rural to urban area, so that makes like less people to farm, and then that makes like less production of food and then less manufacturing.
To some degree, that's true. I think the reason they mention that in this section of the text is that they're suggesting that the priority was the cities, right? So whatever happened, Stalin wanted to make sure that there was enough food in the cities for city workers, because they were the ones who were kind of driving industrialization, right? So they had to make sure that he had to make sure first and foremost that those people were fed, right? And so there was a priority to get food to the cities rather than the countryside. So that's true, but I think it's more of a background or a context thing. Okay, we're out of time here, so I'm gonna press pause on this. We'll come back to this tomorrow and sort through it, okay? So that's all for today, people. Have a good afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow.